These women last heard this music sung over 40 years ago. Then they were the singers. They were prisoners of the Japanese during the Second World War, interned for 3.5 years on the island of Sumatra. Behind the barbed wire, 30 Dutch, British, and Australian women formed a vocal orchestra. They sang the music of Beethoven, Brahms, Dvorak. These unique arrangements survived the war, to be resurrected and performed by a choir in California. Some of the original singers have come to this reunion concert to hear again the music that brought some beauty into their lives amidst the ugliness of war. This is their story, a story of devotion to life, a story of the power of music to sustain the human spirit. Two members of the wartime vocal orchestra, Sister Katrina and Helen Collane, returned to Sumatra in 1984. They've come to a place called Balalau to remember the most crucial and terrible time of their lives, a time when a friend died nearly every day.
I remember when we had to bring people to the graveyard, we had to go up the hill. It was very heavy. People said, people who are longing for heaven are light, and people who don't want to die are heavy. That were the carriers. That was the theory of the carriers, which I didn't believe, but they told me. I very often was a carrier, so I heard them speak about it. She is heavy, isn't she? She doesn't want to die.
There are no artifacts here for the inhabitants to ponder. Nothing to cause them to wonder about the history of this place. 40 years have passed since the rubber forest witnessed unremitting disease and death. 40 years since the end of the war, when Allied aircraft dropped provisions to feed those who survived. The children of Balalau know little of the war. They are 2 generations removed. They sing to please the visitors, not knowing why they've come. They sing a patriotic song of independent Indonesia, their nation of islands. Islands which were known as the Dutch East Indies during the height of European colonialism, before the war. Safe in ornate European-style houses and tended by native servants, many Westerners led lives of ease and tranquility in the Southeast Asia of the 1920s and 30s. The French governed Indochina. The British ruled Burma, Malaya, and Singapore. The Dutch controlled the East Indies. Helen Collane came here from the Netherlands, as did her parents and 2 sisters in the 1930s. Helen's father, Anton, managed an oil facility for Royal Dutch Petroleum. They were part of a large community of Dutch who lived in enclaves near the native villages, holding their European manners and customs dear, paying little heed to the growing anti-Western movement in Japan. The Japanese assault on Western colonialism began with unexpected fury in December 1941. England, France, and the Netherlands were at war with Germany in Europe, leaving their Asian colonies ill-prepared for the Japanese onslaught. By March 1942, the East Indies were in Japanese hands. Anton Kalain was taken prisoner, forced from his home on the island of Tarakan, and ordered to lead his Japanese captors to the Dutch-controlled oil fields of Balikpapan on Borneo. His wife, Zus, was held hostage.
When I said goodbye to Anton in Tarakan, the last thing he told me, he said, "Whatever happens to you, don't feel bitter about it, because bitterness will destroy you." And that has helped me a great deal later on, because there were many things I was very bitter about. And then I thought the last word Anton told me, don't feel bitter about the things that will destroy you. And I didn't. I could put it off. It was his last gift to me.
Zus Kalain was placed in an internment camp on Borneo, where she was to stay for almost 4 years. Anton escaped briefly and met Helen and her sisters on the island of Java, but it was too late to flee the island safely. Their ship was bombed and sunk the second day out, off Sumatra. The Kalains reached the shore in lifeboats, only to be captured and imprisoned in the town of Palembang.
It was a tremendous shock to be captured. We had already survived the shipwreck. We'd been a week in lifeboats. We trekked for 3 weeks through the jungle, and I say we, my father and sisters and I. And there were 3 Japanese on bicycles, and said, "Come with us, you're captured."
The Sisters of Carolus Borromeus were not immune from the Japanese policy of interning non-Asians. Sister Katrinia had come to Sumatra from the Netherlands in 1938 at the age of 30 to teach in a convent school near Palembang. She was imprisoned in March 1942. Also in the Palembang internment camp were 32 Australian military nurses who had been ordered to leave Singapore when it fell in February 1942.
We were outraged that we should have to leave our patients. We'd gone to volunteered for service with the idea that we had a job to do. There was a job to be done. We had a skill to cope with it. And to be ordered to leave when we felt that the need was most was something we found very hard to take. And I remember saying goodbye to one young boy, not goodbye, to say, "We have to leave for a while, we'll see you again." And he looked at me with imploring eyes, and he said, "Sister, when are we going home?"
Mickey Sire's ship was bombed and sunk near Bangka Island off the coast of Sumatra. Also on board was 25-year-old nurse Betty Jeffrey. For Jeff, as everyone called her, internment was a relief after a harrowing week at sea.
I had to row this little raft thing all night long, all that afternoon and all night long. And when I say row, all I had was a little piece of, the paddle was a little piece of stick like that, like the side of a fruit case, a wooden fruit case. It was very rough. And holding it like that and paddling like that, it just took more and more skin, took more and more flesh, and then off the palm of my hand too, till the bones were exposed. And now I have this scar here, which, funnily enough, is the shape of Banker Island, where we landed. So I always say I carry Banker Island around with me.
The Dutch and British colonials, the nuns and missionaries, the Australian nurses, tossed together by the inexorable forces of war, the pattern of their lives suddenly and violently shattered. Official Japanese policy called for internment of all Westerners in Asia for the duration of the war. The Japanese hoped the war would be over quickly. Then the Europeans, Australians, and Americans would be sent back to their native countries. Nearly 100,000 non-Asians were interned in the Dutch East Indies alone. People of mixed Asian and European blood were sometimes interned, sometimes not. A 26-year-old Dutch Eurasian living in Palembang, Nel Mohodim, was given a choice of living in the camp or on the outside.
Inderdaad, die lui hebben me gevraagd, je mag vrij zijn. Toen had ik even om me heen, nee, dat bevalt me niet, omdat ik nooit contact heb gehad met die mensen van Palembang zelf. En ik had altijd contact met mijn eigen vrienden, dat waren dus de Indischen en de Europeanen en de Hollandse gemeente, althans de Nederlandse gemeente. En toen zei ik voel me niet thuis buiten. En dat was eigenlijk min of meer angst van mij om liever opgesloten te zijn dan buiten te zijn. Hè. Omdat die lui die waren toen bij de inval zag ik dus al die soldaten binnenkomen en dat beviel me helemaal niet. Hè. We waren min of meer bang voor die mensen. Wat ook heel begrijpelijk is, want we hadden tenslotte pas voor het eerst zo'n oorlog meegemaakt. Niet?
Scores of camps were scattered across Java, Borneo, and Sumatra. Some camps held close to 10,000 prisoners. The Japanese always separated the women and children from the men before internment. The camp at Palembang at first contained about 300 women and 100 children ranging in age from newborns to teenagers. Sigrid Stronk, the wife of a Dutch planter, had 2 young sons when she was separated from her husband and interned.
People always say it must have been very, very hard for you as mothers with children. I don't so. I think it has been harder for us than for the others. I don't think so. I think we were privileged even to have children, to have something really to live for.
In the beginning, when they could play together, every day was still a wonder for a little child. When we were in the houses camp, it was quite, of course, they were naughty, and they did naughty things because they had no playing material. But the children needed schools, and I knew it was necessary. So we tried to get some children to give lessons to them. There were no books. Some had some copybooks, but not more. But in the houses we find libraries. And from the libraries we took books.
There was a copy of Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, and I struggled through that. And I think we did some math. But that too didn't last too long, partly because of materials missing and energy levels getting lower.
Another child who studied with the nuns in camp was an 11-year-old Dutch boy named Theo Rotier. But he and his brothers were also caught up in the mood of war.
We were always running around in military uniform because we could find helmets and ammunition pouches, and we made ourselves guns and with catapults and all that. So initially there was a sort of British army emerging and a Dutch army emerging, and you're talking about 7 boys this way and 7 the other, the more or less grown up, the 12, 13, 14-year-olds, and always fighting each other.
The Japanese guards were generally tolerant of young children, but their behavior toward the women was unpredictable and often harsh. Misunderstandings were frequent as captors and captives spoke different languages, and cultural differences were strong. Within the Japanese army, officers often slapped subordinates with little provocation. So it was not surprising that the prison camp guards vented their anger on the women for very minor offenses.
The food of the camp used to come in a sort of truck driven by a Japanese driver, and it was thrown out of the truck onto the ground, the road. And then the driver drove away, but he left behind a box that had contained vegetables of some sort. And I saw this and I thought to myself, we haven't got anything to sit on in our little garage where we lived. So I just picked it up and took it home. But somebody saw me do it, and there were traitors in the camp, you know, ones who thought they would gain something if they told about some misdemeanor on the part of somebody, and somebody told on me. And so there was a cry for the one who had taken the box, you see, and for the sake of everybody else, I took the box back down the hill to the spot, handed it with a bow to the Japanese gentleman, who proceeded to wah, 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 wah. And that was that. So I didn't ever do it again.
There is an incident I can think back on with pleasure, and that is when we were rounded up in the first camp, which was a group of houses with a fence around it. We noticed at one point that far away, beyond the gate on the road, there were prisoners coming by every day, every morning, with a guard. And so when we saw that, or when the women saw that, we would all rush down and see what we could see. But the three of us climbed on the roof of the house on which we were, and we had found a towel, and we waved with this orange towel in the hope that Father would see this, which he did, and waved back. So far, yet so close. But at least we knew they were there, and everybody recognized his father or her husband or whatever it was. That was in the beginning.
The sight of the Culzean girls yelling and waving from the rooftop had cheered Bill McDougall, an American correspondent interned with Anton Culzean in the men's camp. But one December morning in 1942, McDougall, who became a priest after the war, heard no sound from the women's camp.
Christmas Day, we went out, and instead of screaming, they were silent, dead silent. And suddenly we heard singing. And across this abyss between us came this beautiful, "Come all ye faithful." And then silent night. We stood there with the guards around us. The guards moved, they flew, move on, but they were entranced too. And it was really so moving, we wept. Even now, I think, how wonderful that was to give us this life, spirit.
Singing was the primary diversion available to the women in the camp. They sang songs in the evenings as one oppressively hot and humid month followed another, and fear gave way to frustration and boredom. Much of the singing was organized by a British missionary named Margaret Dryborough, who had lived in China and Singapore, teaching English and music before the war. In the prison camp, Miss Dryborough was a driving force, constantly organizing activities to boost morale. She wrote poems and plays. She brightened birthdays with gifts of drawings or specially written songs. But after 18 months in captivity, she felt the women needed something new and fresh to lift their flagging spirits. Nora Chambers, who had studied music at the Royal Academy in London, approached Miss Dryborough with an idea.
I said, I wonder if we could try classical music without words. For instance, music that is done by quartets or symphonies or whatever. And she sat me and she says, yes, let's have a try.
Margaret Driver's memory for the music of her past was extraordinary. She had no sheet music, no instruments, but she was able to recall the melodies and harmonies of over 24 orchestral and piano themes and arrange them for 4-part women's voices. The vocal orchestra was born.
Margaret and I didn't realize it at the time. We were thinking really of doing something different. And slowly but surely we began to realize that it was drawing more and more people together. It was a sort of unifying thing. There were the Australian nursing sisters, 2 sets of Dutch nuns, nursing nuns and teaching nuns, and there was 1 New Zealander. There were Dutch Eurasians and British Eurasians, and there was even Chinese, 1 Chinese. And also things were a bit mucky and in a mess, and it was not a very nice place, and you had to think of something that took people's minds off things. And we used to have these rehearsals at night with 1 little lamp, and they sat on boxes, and we wrote the music out as best we could on bits of paper. And we started to sing and started to learn.
It was something we had never done before, and so at first we would try out the score all together, and then after having done that and finding out where the mistakes were, some of us would go on our own together, and having copied the score from Laura or Margaret Driver, we would then try out the weak spots.
We were having one of our rehearsals in the Dutch kitchen one night, and everything was going along beautifully, and it was, of course, superb as usual, and everybody enjoying themselves. And we did the unfinished symphony, or we were doing the unfinished symphony, and apparently I came in solo halfway through on a wrong note, and Nora, who was conducting us, just collapsed. It was really terribly funny. She had her hands up conducting us, and then down they went, and everybody just collapsed. And that was the finish. As I say, Jeffrey finished the unfinished symphony, I'm afraid.
And all the solitary voice let out the C sharp, and we all just laughed. Even now she teases me and she says, I'm sure it wasn't me, it must have been somebody else. Yeah, we had a good laugh over that. We had lots of laughs, which was great, which again was great for the morale.
The director of the modern choir, Patricia Hennings, is working with a chorus nearly twice the size of the wartime vocal orchestra. Throughout the year spent in rehearsal, Ms. Hennings received letters from her predecessor, Nora Chambers.
She says, Grieg's Morning, all the runs started off with law. You remember when doing runs in singing lessons, we did them all to legato. Mind you, it isn't easy to sing the runs legato, but have a try. Don't forget, Patty, if you don't like the idea, do it your way. That's how it should be.
And once we got the learning done, actually learning the notes, no color, nothing like that, just learning the notes, then we started to put color. By that I mean light and shade and slow or fast or that sort of thing.
I think what I want you to do is use that concept of legato through that line and add the bas. So instead of ba ba ba, it's ba 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 ba. Let's approach it from 25 one more time. It's about mezzo forte here, and then crescendo in 27. And 2 measures, and you can let us go.
Became very important to get bars 32 and 33 in practicing it just perfectly. That takes your mind off whether you're hungry or thirsty or dirty or sick or whatever.
Ik herinner me even dat stuk van wat ik me zeer goed herinner is. Ik weet niet precies hoe dat heet, maar dikwijls hoor ik dat stuk Danny Boy. Ken je nog herinneren? Danny Boy. Oh, dat vind ik een schat van een stuk.
Dat herinnert u?
Ja, en heel duidelijk ook. Omdat het zo, ja, wat zou ik zeggen? Dat is zo'n verdrietig stuk, hè. En voor de rest, ja, ik kan niet op al die namen komen, ja. Maar in elk geval, het was interessant. Dat was min of meer een, hoe noem je dat toch eigenlijk, een afleiding en een vulling van geest.
They worked very hard, and considering the condition they were in physically, I don't know how they were able to sing some of the things we asked them to sing, and how they were able to hold their breath for long phrases. And you know, they were in a weakened condition, but they did, and I was very proud of them.
Following Nora was just so easy. You just did what she made. Well, she made you do it with her hands, her expression, movement of her head, and you just did it. It was marvelous experience, the whole thing, and of course the music itself. Having it and doing it. You just were not in a dirty little scruffy, tatty prison camp in Sumatra. You were way out in the open. You just seemed, you know, free, somewhere beautiful.
After a year, we suddenly had to go to the Japanese guard's house, not knowing what was going on, because you never knew what was going on with these fellas. They were absolutely unpredictable. As we walked through that corridor into that backyard, a walled backyard, and you're perfectly in the, let's say, it's the scene there for an execution. Yeah, it's a walled garden there, and we stood there and we were ordered to undress. And one of these fellas, one of the older boys, still whispered to us, "Hey, we're not going to undress." Japanese overheard that, and as short as possible, and in time he got a few slaps around and a few kicks, and we were out of our pants in no time. And there we stood naked, and they looked at us and they said, you, report at 4 o'clock in the afternoon with whatever personal belongings you have, and you're off. Where? Nobody knows. Yeah, we got back to the camp and told our mother, of course, that we were off in the afternoon at 4 o'clock. And that must have been horrible for my mother and for all the other mothers who were involved, 8 or 9. And at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, there we went. But the strange thing is, we didn't know where we were heading for. Destination unknown, and a clear sign of that is, had they known that we were heading for the men's camp, we would have been loaded with messages, letters or whatever, and we arrived with nothing.
Well, after a year and a half in this houses camp, we were moved suddenly to only a mile away, I think, to a camp in Palembang with barracks, the ramshackle barracks with flimsy roofs covered with palm frond. And every time a storm blew, the leaves blew off and the water came onto the platforms on which we slept, crowded together there. At some time we only had no more than 2 feet width to go around, to sleep on. There were cockroaches, bed bugs, rats, all kinds of things that we didn't have in that first camp, and the food gradually became very, very bad.
They'd bring in an egg. Well, what do you do with one egg between that many people? And, mind you, everybody's hungry and everybody's eyes are watching that one egg. Do you give it to one person and hope that more eggs will come in so that everybody gets one eventually, or do you scramble it and give them a spare? All sort of irritating things like that. They'd bring in vegetables, or a couple of times a week. It was mainly kangkong, which is a bit like spinach, I suppose.
They used to bring in some meat and throw it down on the ground, on the bitumen, put their foot on it, get their bayonet out and hack it into pieces, and then just throw it to us as though we were dogs.
There was an awful lot of sickness, and you got weaker every time you were sick with this malaria, the dysentery, the beriberi, every blessed tropical disease you could think of we had, and we tried to nurse it. Well, we did nurse it. No beds or anything like that. They were just lying shoulder to shoulder, and we would have to step up onto the thing and nurse them onto the bed space, which was just like a long shelf, about 6 feet wide and about 50 feet long. There were these poor people, and all we had were rice sacks to put over them.
You didn't have the medicines, and the Japanese wouldn't give you any. They just refused. You had no treatment for malaria or amoebic dysentery or any of these pellagra or beriberi. Nobody received any treatment. Once in a while you might get a bit of quinine bark, but that was very rarely.
And I was looking after these patients with beriberi. Now they swell up, and you can't bend your legs, you can't lift up a step. You had to lift your leg up, even a step that high. You couldn't lift it yourself. And one of the nuns, her arms were so swollen and her body, she couldn't feed herself because she couldn't bend her arms. And if you went like that, her skin just peeled off. And I used to feed Sister Olga. She was a Dutch nun. And I think she was an engineer by profession. She was a very well-educated woman. She used to say to me, "Sister Vilma, you are so good. Thank you so much for looking after me. I am going to my Father in heaven and I will pray for you." She used to say that to me every day, and eventually she did die.
You were so quite sure one day it will be gone. It can't be forever. Someday the war will be finished. The war will be won. And then things will come back again. That was a trust in you.
The vocal orchestra rehearsed through the fall of 1943. Then, in December, they gave their first concert. An expectant audience gathered in the square outside the barracks.
It was Christmas time, and everybody came and around this square where we were, and the choir came in with their little stools. They weren't strong enough to stand. And then the crowd gathered around, and then the Japs got a bit annoyed. One guard came up with his bayonet and said, "Oi, oi," the sign language and sounds they made, because we didn't understand what they were saying. But we understood what he meant. They didn't like people gathering in crowds. And I didn't take any notice. I thought the best thing was to carry on, which I did. I raised my hand and we started. And strangely enough, he stopped and he just sat there and listened. And it did a tremendous amount of good for those people in the camp. A lot of them were weeping. I think it brought memories back, and I think it was a good thing from that point of view.
The festive way they came, the way they talked about it days before, and the way they tried to make up a little bit, to be different from other days, and the festive way they were sitting and listening and talking about it afterwards. It was something that grew in between us, and it lived in between us, and it made us more near together. That was the wonder of the music.
1944. The drudgery of camp life continued, brightened occasionally by vocal orchestra concerts. All the women grew steadily weaker and constantly worried about their loved ones. No reliable news of the war was available.
We were in prison camp almost 4 years, and all that time we had no idea what the war was doing, where my husband was, what happened to my girls, and all of us were in the same condition. That was almost the worst of being in prison camp, was isolation from the world.
In September 1944, the internees, who now numbered over 700, were moved yet again, packed into rickety boats and taken down the Musi River and across the Banca Strait to Banca Island.
When we arrived off Banca Island in this sort of paddle steamer type of thing, we couldn't get right into the wharf, and they had to put us into this awful junk thing, and we jumped into this junk, and it was about 4 inches deep with kerosene or some horrible volatile fluid like that, which we had to sit in. And then they closed the roof, and there were quite a number of us in there packed shoulder to shoulder, and it was pitch black, and it was dreadful, and they set us adrift from the ship, and we immediately started to get seasick. Then there was an air raid, and it was all awful. And by the time we finally reached that wharf and they opened up the hatch, we were just semi-conscious. And it was not until I got into the new camp, I put my hand round my back to get my diary, I realised I didn't have it. And I thought, oh, where is it? How dreadful, somebody's going to find it. Because, you know, not allowed to have papers, and I thought, off with the head. So that was all right, I couldn't do anything about it, but next day I had a pretty awful dose of malaria, and I was just lying there on my bed space with this temperature, feeling ghastly. And along came a Japanese guard, holding up the little bag thing, calling out, you know, Appa, Appa, you know, who owns it, who owns it? And I said, yeah, I do, I do. And he brought it to me, and I thanked him very much, and it was marvellous. Nobody had touched it, they hadn't opened it. You know, they're peculiar, they did some funny things, but they did some very good things too.
The camp on Banca Island was the worst yet. Drinking water was scarce, latrines had to be emptied by hand, and the surrounding swampland harbored yet another fatal disease, Banca fever.
It was New Year's Eve, 1944, around midnight, and I was in bed and I had this terrible Banca fever we all had, shivering and cold and miserable. And then it was near 12 o'clock, and at the other end of my barrack, Sister Katrina and other sisters were singing just for the coming New Year, the end of the year and the coming New Year. And then I was lying there feeling horrible, and I thought, oh, I wish I could sleep now, forever.
The mothers who died, that were the mothers who took so much care of the children, who gave part of their food to the children. The best thing for a mother to do was take her own portion and gave the portion to the children she got for her children. But if she gave more to the children and ate herself less, she couldn't go on very long, and then she died. And the little children came to us, and they were wonderful, clever little children, but they were all round little bellies full of water. If you have no food, slowly you grow bigger, but you grow bigger full of water.
As the tide of the war turned against the Japanese, rations and medical supplies grew even worse. The officer in charge of medical care for the Banca Island camp was Dr. Kumihiko Yamada.
当時、日本からの輸送船、それは医薬品とか食料、それから軍事物資もほとんど内地から到着しないので、緑留所だけでなくて、日本軍全体で医薬品などは特に不自由しておりました。ただ医薬品の配給っていうのは戦闘する部隊を優先的に多く配給して、 戦闘に参加しない部隊には少なくなると。例えば党の躍進があったとすると、航空隊のような実際に戦争をする部隊には5つ行って、それで戦闘しない例えば緑竜所とか通信隊とかそういうところの部隊には1つぐらいしか配給にならなかったというような関係です。
On Banca Island, malnutrition, disease, and death finally silenced the vocal orchestra.
We all began to peter out physically, and we lost 15 members of that choir, and by then it was quite hopeless. We couldn't carry on. And so that was the end of it. But it was a tremendous thing when it happened. We didn't realize, Margaret and I, what it would mean, but it was tremendous.
The manuscripts were hidden away, treasured mementos of a less painful time. The women still clung to the spirit of the music, but their weakened bodies could barely survive, let alone sing. In the men's camp, conditions were the same. Teorotia had been with the men for nearly 2 years, separated from his mother and younger brothers. In January 1945, after months of pleading with the guards, he was allowed one short visit.
We saw the barracks camp and there was barbed wire, and we were standing 5 meters on this side, and suddenly my mother was there on the other side with 3 of my brothers still. Later I heard that when she knew that we were there, she quickly dressed up and tried to get a sort of long skirt on to hide her berry legs and to hide that she was fully emaciated by that time. But yeah, it was only a matter of 2 minutes. You could hardly speak or something. You could only wave a little. And yeah, okay, then we had to get onto that truck again. And yeah, that was the end. Because 3 months later she died.
"76 women and children had died in the Banca Island camp from October 1944 to April 1945. But the worst lay ahead. For no apparent reason, the Japanese moved their captives a third time. A 3-day journey by boat, train, and truck brought them deep into the Sumatran jungle, to a rubber plantation, Balalau.
And the children were so very weak, they were no child anymore. They just were old men and women, sitting together and talking about food. And looking at the kitchen, they just went to the side of our barrack that had a view on the kitchen. And then they took their little benches over there, sat together in a little row, looked at each other, at this side, at that side, and were speaking about what are we going to eat. And they told each other every day the same story. It's kangkung today, yeah? Kangkung, kangkung, kangkung.
Somebody died, we reported it to the guardhouse so that a coffin of sorts could be made. Usually it was made from very crude bits of timber of some sort, and the measurements of the person who had died weren't necessarily correct, and it was quite often that the coffin was too small. And so we had to use all sorts of devices to try and make it so that the body could be carried in this, as this was the only coffin at the time that was available. And it was sometimes very hurtful when it was a friend whose body we had to make to fit the box. Well, then the coffins were buried outside the camp. And in the beginning, the Japanese did the digging. I know there was one day when instead of being one hole that was built, 8 were, even though 8 people hadn't particularly died that day. It was the Japanese having some ready in advance, which was a hurtful thing too.
I remember when we had to bring people to the graveyard. We had to go up the hill. It was very heavy. We had to dig the grave ourselves, put in people you knew so well, and then we had to close it and went away. And later, Nora Chambers made some crosses with the names on it. Do you remember?
Yeah, she burned them in the kitchen with a nail.
Yes, she couldn't stand it that they were just somewhere. They want to have the name of the one who was under the earth now.
Shortly after the journey to Balalau, Margaret Drybra, who created the vocal orchestra, became seriously ill. On April 21st, 1945, only 4 months before the end of the war, she died.
And it was even that her box was too small. And that's what was very, very hurtful to those of us who were helping with it. Yes. But it was as many of us who possibly could were there for that, because she meant so much to the camp. She had given so much of herself in so many ways and created so much beauty for us all.
Just before the end, strange things started to happen. I mean, we got more food, if I remember right, and the Japs became a bit jittery. And then one day we were called all together, and the camp commander came in and said, it must have been on the 24th or the 28th of August, I don't remember exactly, 45. And he said, "Prang sudah habis." The war has ended. And there we stood. And I remember feeling, and Mommy did the same, we felt like a balloon which had been pricked with a needle, you know. Plof. That was it. We had imagined, at least I had imagined it so differently, that you would really explode into an expression of joy. But it didn't happen. It was very curious.
We heard the war was over, but nothing changed. I was sick, others were sick. My father wasn't there to celebrate with anymore. We had heard about 3 months before that he had died in a men's camp. And the vaguest idea where my mother was she still alive? We hadn't heard from her for almost 4 years. And other people were in the same boat, in the same condition. So not really until 2 weeks later, the first food was dropped, did we have a sense that the war was over, that there was actually something happening in our lives that was different from all those other years that had gone by.
And suddenly the Jap said, well, the children are allowed to go to the men's camp, who was also at Balalau, another part of this rubber estate, and see their father. So we all tried to find something clean and still a little bit nice, and dressed our children. So Gijs Willem was 3.5 and Dirk was 9.5. And they were ready to go. And then I think it was Sister Katrinia who came to me. She probably, or Mother Laurentia probably had got a list, and she came to tell me that he died already at the end of 44. And then for the children it was very, very hard, of course. All the children went to see their father and they just stayed behind.
"40 years after the end of the war, a reunion is held near Amsterdam. 80 men and women who were children in the camps, and some of the Dutch nuns who cared for them, have come. Most have not seen each other since the war.
I'm satisfied with small things nowadays. I think I can never get upset about a hardship. I can easily adjust wherever I get. And that applies to my brothers as well. But small things in life, you're happy.
We were just an ordinary group of women. I think every one of us was a different personality. But it would seem, looking back on it, as if nearly everybody in that camp was hand-picked because you just did cope.
We learned to understand each other, we learned to depend on each other, and we learned to help each other. And it was a tremendous experience.
One should be grateful for all the things one learnt. It gave us such strength that it is built into our lives somehow or other. It's the most incredible business.
After 40 years, I hadn't thought very much of the camp. It was far away in my mind. But the music still stayed. And every time when I heard in a concert hall or on the radio parts we had sung, then that came back again.
Keep us We're going, Audrey.